Alex, you ready? Jerry Benjamin is going to start us off with a welcome.
Welcome to your state university. Good evening. And welcome to our brand and wonderful new science building. You know, in the late 1940s, when I was a small boy, we drank tap water in Brooklyn. My mother was very fastidious. She believed in the germ theory of disease. In fact, she told me once that it wasn't a theory. They really were germs. And she let us drink water from fountains at school and in the park, as long as we didn't touch the spout with our mouths. You know, we were not environmentalists. We ran the water all summer to make it cold. And we didn't know that New York City had this marvelous water system that was an engineering miracle, and that some of our water originated in the pristine precincts of Ulster County. From our point of view, water was free. Water wasn't metered in New York. We paid our water bill on the basis of frontage. We didn't pay it, the landlord did on the apartment house, so we never got a water bill. And we felt entitled to water. It came out of the tap and it was free because people should have water that they could drink. And this was not just in New York City, this was everywhere in New York State. And you found water systems established in villages and cities at great expense to meet this idea, this notion of stream that water is for everyone. Water is an entitlement. Water should be free. We did some work in Johnstown, and there's an elected water board there. I don't know how many people know that. There are 2 elected water boards in New York State. And I was reminded that water was such a massive cost to establish in communities that it was separately governed and separately accountable to the public. Now let's flip the calendar forward, because Tobin gave me 5 minutes. In the early 70s, I got to go outside the country. My father said, "Why are you going to Europe? We took it so hard for us to leave there. And you're going back by choice." And I found a curiosity. I found in France people were walking around with bottles of water that they actually bought. So they were buying water and I was getting free water. I thought that was a little silly. And then in the 80s I went to Asia and I stayed in hotels where there were signs in the bathroom that said, "Don't drink the water." An alternative water supply was provided for people. That's still true. I was in Hong Kong just a few weeks ago, and there was a sign in the bathroom of my hotel room that said, "Don't drink the water." And water is alternatively provided. Hong Kong, a world city, an extraordinary place. So this notion that water is free and that available for everyone and that it should be potable on demand is still not present across the world. It was in a way, it was an illusion that fresh water was a right and an entitlement when it came to a world perspective. Now back here, I started seeing people carrying around water, and people started selling water to other people who bought it. It's like kind of cable television. Buying something you got for nothing, or at least we thought we were getting for nothing. So there was sort of a fad, it was sort of a cultural phenomenon, a manifestation of class difference, that some people would buy water. And soon people it was sort of like Starbucks, you know, water was better if you paid more for it. In Starbucks case, it was coffee. So soon some people came to believe that bottled water was better than tap water. It would taste better. It was more healthy for you. Some of you may have observed that this is the case. In some families, children aren't permitted to drink tap water. Now, there's the environmental movement, and if you look at the water fountains in this building, we give people the chance to fill up their water bottles, and it became an act of virtue to resist plastic bottles. On campus one day, we walked into the president's conference room and found a picture. Acknowledgement of the success of the environmental movement in school. So we have new fountains to fill water bottles. And then we discovered quality issues in our water. Hoosick Falls, Newburgh. Wells across the Hudson Valley that were polluted by adjacent industrial developments. Lead testing in schools with water fountains labeled, "Don't drink this water." So in effect, we were validating ex post facto our choice to have water that we bought, because the water that we were providing, that was our entitlement, was no longer okay. Now, this not only happened in specific places, this happened in people's minds. They came to believe if this happened in one city, it was happening in other cities. And they were afraid of the water. And we lost our massive investment game to be at risk, as you all know. Our governance processes got very complicated. Confidence in government declined. And we discovered that we have a crisis in water. And we're here today to reestablish the notion that water is for everyone. To help reestablish that idea. Now, I still drink tap water in restaurants. Although if my mother were alive, God bless her, she'd probably wonder if I should. So we have to get back to the right governance, and this is not only a question of the resource, it's a question of democracy. It's the question of what the fundamental obligation is of government to the people in a democratic society. What can we expect as entitlements? What should government provide for us that's clean and good and valuable? And we have a great program to talk about some of these issues tonight. Do we still have 3 women presenters?
Yes, we do.
We have some substitutions, so I wanted to make sure that was right. We have our colleague, Michael Frank, taking notes and asking people questions. Stand up, Michael. So we're going to blog on this, and we're going to invite you to look at our blog postings. And I'm very much looking forward to learning a lot about the issues and we face and the solutions we can embrace. Thank you for being with us at your university tonight. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm KT Tobin. I'm the Associate Director of the Benjamin Center, as well as the Deputy Mayor in the Village of New Paltz. So I'm definitely wearing both of my hats at the same time tonight. Usually I have to pick one. In the interest of saving trees, we have put our agenda all electronic, which has been flashing through since we started this evening. I'll be introducing our first 3 speakers, and then we are going to proceed to a panel discussion. Our first speaker, Sabrina Tai, is, oops, didn't move, hold please, is Sabrina M. Tai, the President and CEO of the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation. Thank you for coming, Sabrina. She's going to talk about actions New York State is taking to respond to these challenges.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, and of course Dr. Tobin and Mayor Rogers as well for inviting me here. Actually, it was very interesting what Dr. Benjamin was talking about, right? There's a lot of those issues that swirl around constantly, and this whole conversation about not just the quality of water, but affordability and our sort of quote-unquote entitlement to it. And there's a lot of conversations about that, which I wish we could spend a little more time talking about, but tonight I am really going to focus on what New York State is doing. So, certainly what we're talking about tonight is a really important one, and it's really topical. topical now because, as Dr. Benjamin mentioned, there was Flint, and then closer to home, Pulic, Newburgh, and all those issues that sort of follow with it. Now, what's interesting, though, is that although that's brought it to the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and interestingly, I think that it also, in an odd way, is one of the few pieces that allows funding for it at the federal level to remain somewhat protected, right? Because of all these issues and with all the cuts that the federal government has made to the budgets of various agencies, most, predominantly the EPA, money and funding for infrastructure is one of those things that has not only stayed flat, but increased slightly. So for every bad, at least, we're trying to look at things optimistically, which I like to do, that's sort of a small plus. But, the fact is, I think just about everyone in this room, if not, just about everyone, most of you, if not all of you, have already spent a lot of time sort of thinking about these issues and, what are we supposed to do about it? And, there is a lot that we need to think about. So what's really interesting about this event, though, is that it actually recognizes that, in order to meet and address the water challenges that we have in New York State, that it actually comes on multiple fronts, right? It's infrastructure, it's open space, it's local water. And so similarly, New York State and the governor have also actually, their approach and his approach has also been multi-pronged. So I think the best example, which is what we're talking about here, is the $2.5 billion Clean Water Infrastructure Act that was enacted last year during the budget. Now, what it does, it sort of reflects the understanding that all these pieces are tied together and that, everything has an impact on drinking water. So, and understanding that one size fits all, there's no silver bullet to this, that CWIA, the Clean Water Infrastructure Act, actually provides sort of a continuum of programs that are contained with it, as well as a historic level of funding to support that. So I'm just going to talk about a few of those pieces, not all of them. But so first, I think it's really important to note that there was $110 million for land acquisition projects, right, that provide source water protection. So that's one of the issues that we talk about constantly. What are some of the eligible programs that they were looking at? So it really includes the protection of surface drinking water supplies as well as groundwater drinking water supplies. What are some of the priorities? Because again, you have to focus on different things. So the priorities included regional priority conservation projects for drinking water protection in the New York State Open Space Plan. And it also includes practices to reduce disinfection byproducts in surface water bodies that are being used for drinking water. And actually, what's really interesting about PUIA is that although the budget was only last April, and you'll see as I'm talking about this, a lot of that money's already getting out the door, right? Because I think that's one of the things that is often a criticism of government. Oh, sure, you're saying all this, but you're paying lip service to it, and nothing's actually happening. But with regards to this, it actually, the first pieces of it were included in the consolidated funding application process, so this whole regional economic development competition in which, people go in and apply for and awarded grants. So actually in that first round, which were announced in December, there were 13 awards, totaling almost $15 million. And actually of those 13 projects, 4 were in the Hudson Valley region. So it actually includes almost $1 million to the Dutchess Land Conservancy, $1.2 million, and I think I'm going to handle this, the Winnicke Land Trust Sawkill land acquisition. There's 1.7 to the Orange County Water Authority, and $3 million to the city of Middletown for their land acquisition project for source water protection. So again, those are all dollars that are going to go out, that are going to start protecting your source water almost immediately. In addition to that, there was $130 million to support, costs of mitigation and remediation at solid waste sites to ensure that the drinking water meets applicable standards. And then, in addition to that, $50 million in grants to offset the cost of water quality protection measures at CAFOs. So for that, actually, the first round of $20 million in awards went to 61 farms in 25 counties across the state. So the piece that I like to talk about, because it's the one I understand a little bit better, of course, more than the rest of those, is the $1 billion for the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act. So this provides grants for drinking water and clean water infrastructure across the whole state. And as you can imagine, right, it was extremely well received. And it's been, you know, it was initially established in 2015, a few years ago, and, you know, and it's been oversubscribed every single year because, you know, the increase in the funding level since, you know, even though the funding levels increased repeatedly, that's sort of what happened. And it really has helped to catalyze, right, communities all over the state to think about their projects and to get started. And it's really worked because it's really started to move the needle in a meaningful way, in a positive direction. So for example, on drinking water side alone, about $225 million in grants, 135 projects, has generated $500 million investment in infrastructure and $400 million in taxpayer savings. And that's just drinking water. If you add everything all together, you actually get over $2 billion in, you know, sort of address as far as project needs, and then $1.2 billion in taxpayer savings. I think what that's really telling us is that, you know, of course there's a need out there, there's a way to balance those things, and how are we going to go about it? And one of the things that I want to say with regards to EFC, and certainly in drinking water, is that, you know, every single drinking water project that has actually come into EFC, that they go on what we call our intended use plan, and they actually apply for funding, and they're eligible projects, every single one has received financing. So there isn't a single one that actually has come in and said, we want money that we haven't been able to give money to. There's various types of financings that are available, but they are getting funding, which I think is sort of an important thing to remember. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons why municipalities don't come in for any reason. One of the things, of course, I've been talking about, which makes sense, is sort of the affordability and what's going on with that, and that's something we try to address. Now, you know, in addition to that, in response to it, we also created a $30 million Inter-Municipal Grant program, which really was trying to address a couple of issues that we were responding to. One of which was, listen, you know what, from a policy perspective, we wanted to encourage communities to work together because it often results actually in more affordable infrastructure, but it also is something that benefits a regional and a broader area, no matter what. And then the other thing is that we were able to consider, and you know, one thing that we were doing is evaluating on criteria other than just purely sort of your water quality, because it was hard to compete just on water quality with other things. So one of the factors we consider, for example, is community support for a project. So it allows more different types of projects to come in. So I just want to pivot really briefly at the end, because this is sort of one side, right, of the equation. The other side of the equation is identifying the question of identifying strategies on how you address emerging contaminants in drinking water and how do you do those sort of things. And so part of that was the Drinking Water Quality Council was established also last year subsequent to the budget. They've met a couple of times, but long story short, they've really been focusing on a couple of things right now, right? PFOA, PFOS, 1,4-dioxane, not a surprise to everybody. They've met a few times. The expectation is that they will be coming out with a recommendation for enforceable MCLs. Everyone, right? Everyone. Okay, and you know, by the end of the first quarter, so within the next couple of months, and the goal, given the timing for public comment, as well as the time to get all the regs together, is actually to have everything in place so that we can actually start testing by the end of the year. So again, all of these things, you know, are things that I want to show, yes, that there actually is progress, right? And both the state as well as the governor have really been working towards taking tangible steps as to what's going on, things that you can see and feel that are happening. But you know, a lot of that and all of those steps, and many of them were taken based on feedback just from people who care about this issue and who are invested in this issue. So, and how they share those things. So listen, we're a ways from being done, but you know, I think continuing to work with everyone and everyone here as our partners, I think we can get there sort of one day at a time. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Yvonne Martinez from the State Controller's Office, and I need to thank her for stepping in at the last minute. Her colleague, who was going to be here today, is sick, so I think everybody knows there's a lot going around. But Yvonne rose to the occasion, and she's going to talk about a lot about how much this would cost if we could do all the things that we need to do. I also want to mention that the Controller's Office brought a lot of reports with them, and they're out on the table as well if you want to dig in more to this issue. Thanks, Yvonne.
Good evening, everyone. What did I do there? Go ahead. So I'm Yvonne Martinez. Again, I'm with the State Controller's Office. I appreciate having the opportunity to step in, and I appreciate the fact that the House asked us to come here and talk a little bit about how we look at this issue of water needs, water infrastructure. So I work in the Division of Local Government and School Accountability, and we're all obviously keenly aware of the fact that this issue is one that's not going away. It demands our full attention. The reason we're so interested in the issue is because in the controller's role as overseer of municipal finances and the fiscal condition of local governments, we have an issue here. In February of last year, we issued a report, and yes, we did bring quite a few of them, drinking water systems in New York, up at the front. And we wanted to really elevate the conversation with our local officials in mind. So we decided to provide somewhat of a backgrounder, if you will, that spoke to issues around the various water systems. And really just how water is provided, how it's regulated, how it's funded, but more importantly, drawing some attention to the enormous estimated price tag. We didn't come up with these numbers, but we found them fairly easily, ranging from $22 billion over the next 20 years to $39 billion over the next 20 years. One number coming from the EPA, one number coming from the Department of Health. So whichever number you pick, it's massive. It's a huge concern for our local governments, in addition to taxpayers, etc. So one of the key functions of our office is to collect financial data from our local governments. And because we sit on all of that data, we're constantly looking for ways to tell a story to the public, to give some sense of what the concerns might be relative to the financial condition of those local governments. So just a few fun facts from our report, and this is all based on the annual filing. There are 939 local governments that have water departments or districts, with a total revenue of $1.1 billion, and that's not including New York City. Major municipal water revenue, 79% are derived from water fees and charges, 15% from property taxes. On the expenditure side, 49% on contractual, 33% on personal services and benefits, and then 15% on debt service. There are also 27 public water authorities with revenues totaling $4.6 billion, and that is including New York City. So those are big numbers. Again, whenever you have this monumental cost confronting you and this level of revenues, it's of importance to a variety of stakeholders. Some of the key challenges we see for local governments, and we've been able to zero in on these because we also have an audit function. Of course, water loss is a big issue. We highlight some notable water main breaks in the city of Syracuse, in the city of Albany, Troy, and New York City. Another challenge is, of course, contamination. We've already mentioned major stories out of Pulic Falls and other places. And again, we have some more information provided in our report. School districts with the problem of lead contamination, and I don't know how many of you are aware of the legislation that was passed requiring public school districts to then test for lead. That in and of itself is a whole new book of business for our auditors, because now we have to be in the business of making sure that that's actually happening. We know that water systems can be vulnerable to natural disasters and vandalism, but nowadays, with the advent of internet-connected industrial control systems, local governments, they also have to focus on emerging security threats in the area of cyber attacks. Again, we've seen examples here in New York. This is a real problem that can threaten the purity of our water sources, the integrity of the related infrastructure, and we're trying to fight this problem from all angles. We have local officials that contact us all the time because they're concerned about this. Maybe they've experienced some issues around this topic, and so a lot of times they don't necessarily have the resources that they need to prepare themselves or to respond when these types of issues crop up. So in terms of paying for how you even begin to process this daunting dollar figure that we're looking at. Obviously most of the water infrastructure in New York State is aging and reaching the end of its useful life. If you think about it though, so much of this infrastructure is underground, out of sight, out of mind. And if it's not until there is a failure or some contamination that maybe people really start to get focused and the attention, priority is where it needs to be. And that can be from all angles. That can be from local official, that can be just from the general public. Once you do get people focused though, and the conversation then turns to the idea of, well, maybe one way we start to think about paying for these costs is raising rates. Well, that changes the dynamic of the conversation too. Again, we talked earlier, or Dr. Benjamin talked earlier about the idea that water is an entitlement. So it's a balancing act because we know there's this huge cost looming. We know it has to get paid for in some way. But the specific ideas that come to the forefront, depending on what they are, can cause a lot of controversy locally. So we have some recommendations. Again, thinking of this from the fiscal impact to local governments. Of course, we recommend realistic budgeting, planning, multi-year and capital planning. On audit, we have found that in fact a lot of local governments don't do multi-year planning. They don't do capital planning. And even when they do, once fiscal times get rough, they're not so committed to continuing to plan. It's the first thing that takes the back seat. Along with this, there are tools that they have. We have found perhaps they're not using capital reserve funds, which are available to them, and it's a tool that, again, if you're thoughtful and if you're mindful about what tools are at your disposal, this is one way that you can plan for the future. A communication strategy is key in talking to your taxpayers about what the options are. They need to be informed. When we write reports like this, we really do take the time, we really do make an effort to break down the topic in a way that's meaningful to a reader who really doesn't have a lot of time and maybe doesn't have a lot of focus. Try and get to the point of the issue at hand, talk about why it should be important to them, and I think that for local officials, this is a strategy. You need to be able to talk to your taxpayers and make them fully understand what's at stake. Funding opportunities, of course, we have seen some new infusions of money, and that's all good news. knowing what they are, what they require, and taking time to educate yourself as not only a local official, but also as a taxpayer. And one thing that we stress, we have a fiscal stress monitoring system, and it evaluates budgetary solvency for all local governments across the state. And one point that I think is important to make is that for local governments that are looking to perhaps identify partners, it's important to consider and use the tools available to you to consider the financial condition of your own municipality, but also any other municipality that you're looking to partner with. This is important from a number of angles. Lenders are interested in this. Any granting agencies are interested in this. And as a local official, you too should be interested in knowing who you're about to partner with and what kind of fiscal stress situation they may or may not be in. We have a lot of information on our website about fiscal stress in New York State, a lot of information at the entity level that's available, publicly available. So it's something we encourage everybody to look at, local officials, taxpayers alike. And again, these publications are upfront, so I encourage you. We did not go green, we brought hard copies. Thank you.
So next up, we're going to go in a seemingly different direction, but we promise that we will connect all the dots once we get to the panel. So we have Marilyn Wyman up next, and she's going to talk about the importance and the intersection of forests and those impacts on quality and quantity of water.
Great, thank you for inviting me here. I think I'm going to bring this down to a different level, sort of ground level. I am a forest ecologist, so this is the angle I think I'm going to take this at. So let's start. This is where I work at the Agroforestry Resource Center. We're probably one of the few natural resource forest-based cooperative extensions in the state. We made the decision that we had a lot of forests and forest-related importance that we needed to explore. So if you're ever interested, we're right one county up. We have a 142-acre model forest. I was told to please talk into this. We have a 142-acre model forest. So you can learn about some things that you can do on your forest. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the bigger picture of water and forests. So this gives you an idea of the forests across the United States. If you notice, there's a lot going on the East Coast. The West Coast has a lot of conifers. That's sort of what they do. In New York State, New England, we have the best hardwoods in the world. So that's our claim to fame, and that's what we really need to steward for multiple reasons, including protecting water quality. So if you come down to a state level, you sort of see where forests are distributed throughout New York State. The thing that people are always surprised about is that 63% of our landscape is forested, and of that 63%, over 75% is owned by private individuals. It's not the state, it's not the federal, it's not corporations, it's private individuals, and that's what I spend a lot of my time trying to address. These private landowners, over 500,000 people who own anything from 5 acres to 5,000 acres, many of whom have very little plans about what they're going to do. And I think municipalities are in that same position. If you have forests, and it's great, I work with a lot of land conservancies, they're sequestering forests, and they're helping these lands really become productive in terms of the way that forests can be productive. So this is basically, I'm going to talk about them being filters, preventing erosions, filling reservoirs, creating new water. I might not do that, the new water. We all know photosynthesis, one of the byproducts of photosynthesis is the production of water. So trees actually make it. They not only filter it, but they make it as well. And that they're buffers against flooding, and especially along streams, and we're all in this region very aware of that. So how do forests slow the flow of water? So the canopy leaves intercept rain. It's very important. If you have a raindrop hitting bare ground, it's going to send that dirt into a million directions and create a very turbid situation. All these leaves intercept that water, allow it to gently drop to the surface of the ground. Very important function. Then you have all this debris and material that actually slows the flow once that rain has hit the ground. And then the thick porous soils, depending on the kind of soil structure you have, it's sort of this great filtration system. Not only is a sponge, which it is, but it's also this filtration system. And I know there's a number of municipalities. I know that one municipality I used to live in, we actually did our water through different filtration, sand filtration. So we had big particles, smaller, medium, and then it went through this system. It's sort of like nature. It created nature, and nature is very good at it. So my feeling is always preserve nature to do its function, and then we don't have to worry about some of the other functions. So just, to say it intercepts the water, acts like a sponge, 10 to 40% interception, depending on the species and the time of year and things like that, precipitation rates. And they can absorb up to 18 inches of precipitation, depending on whether they're saturated or not, before they gradually will release it into the streams or allow it to percolate down into the groundwater. Stream sides are also very important for us along stream sides because they can also filter pollutants that are coming into that surface water. And some of the things that illustrate this, especially woody plants, they're very good at removing nutrients, nitrates and phosphates. They remove contaminants, heavy metals, pesticides, solvents, oils, hydrocarbons from soil and water. And these pollutants are either used for growth as nutrients, which is nitrates, that's okay, where they're stored in the wood. And in one study, a single sugar maple growing roadside removed 60 milligrams of cadmium, 140 of chromium, 820 milligrams of nickel, and 5,200 milligrams of lead in a single growing season. So again, maybe not even just for source water, but these trees that are constantly filtering these waters that enter through stormwater runoff or in a variety of ways are incredibly important. They stabilize our stream banks. This is a shot from up in the Catskills that we took. Lack of buffer on this side of the stream versus the forested side that had far less erosion and damage. Trees increase filtration and absorb water. This sort of gets on the urban sort of function. One tree can reduce up to 13,000 gallons per year. And if you lose 10% of your forest cover to impervious surface, like roofs or driveways or whatever, you can double the runoff and increase flood frequency by as much as 28%. So even a small percentage can really have a big impact if we remove that forest cover. And they also clean the air, they filter air pollutants, and they sequester carbon. So it's not just water, but it's air pollution that they help. There's also economic viability of forests. If you buy something made out of wood, you're buying something that's going to sequester carbon for a long time. So I really support local, purchasing local products made from wood. You have the biofuels, you have the firewood, tourism, hunting, all these things. We teach a lot about agroforestry, that's growing crops actually in the forest, shiitake mushrooms, maple syrup, ginseng. There's a lot of things we can actually grow in the forest as a product. We're trying to look into multifunctional riparian buffers, which would be a good way to grow food along these. Threats to forest parcelization. Our parcel sizes, the average parcel size of wood in the 50s was about 40 to 50 acres. Now the average parcel is about 12. Now we're talking about that. Remember I talked about impervious surface? I use this as an example. If you looked at this on an aerial photograph, you'd think, oh, the place with all the trees, that's good. That's really good. No problem there with water quality or runoff. And then you saw the farm. Well, it turns out underneath that canopy, there's a lot of subdivisions. And so with every addition of this subdivision, the loss of that 10% of forest cover to impervious surface doubling that runoff and increasing that flood frequency. In this particular situation, we determined there would be a 25-fold increase in impervious surface area, which would lead to stormwater runoff. Subdivision also leads to forest fragmentation, sort of this idea of islands. You have a big contiguous forest, which is really what we're looking for internationally, nationally, and locally. As soon as you start fragmenting it, you lose its ecological value and you lose its economic value. It makes it much more, when you look at that isolated forest patch in that ag situation, that whole perimeter of that particular forest piece is also vulnerable to invasives. A good way to avoid fragmentation is forest planning. You gotta have a plan. We are very vulnerable. One of our major threats to forests, even if we can preserve them and not fragment them, are invasives. We are the hot spot for forest invasive pests. We've been here in New York, Henry Hudson, it all started. We've been importing a lot of things. We are the ground zero for forest invasive pests. We're losing the ash, I know, in this county. We're losing ash throughout New York State. Look for woodpecker holes. I hope you don't find them. Hemlock-Lily adelgid, a foundation species, stabilizes the streams in the Catskills. There's no other tree that can do that, that can germinate under low light conditions and exist where they exist. Really important to try to get this under control. And they also are along our riparian buffers, so that's another reason we don't want to lose those. We're not replacing trees in this part of the world, in part of New York State. Deer browse, pests, air pollution. There's a lot of reasons why we need to regenerate our forests, but we're not. Don't move firewood more than 50 miles point of origin. I hope these are things everybody knows very well. Climate change is going to be a wild card. This might happen, it may not. But we're going to look at the idea is we have a lot of these pests, and if we don't have pests, the climate is going to change. And maples don't like what's going to happen, and they're going to move north. No, they're going to move north. Their ranges are all going to change, and we're pretty much, we know this. So here we are, where you are. I tried to give sort of a big picture down to a little picture. The forests in this area are incredibly important, both from a municipal level, but part of a larger picture. This shows the connectivity. You have the Catskills and the Shawangons, but then you see, in terms of this continuity, that lighter green is a linkage. It links, it might not be as dense or as recognized as the darker greens, but those linkages are important for connectivity when things are migrating and for preservation. And this is another view of the same thing, where you can sort of see, actually the one shows you globally significant forests because of the size, then regionally significant, and then locally significant. It's the synergy between all those particular forests and the people who have some kind of control over those. We have to start thinking about our forests as the life support system, something that we all depend on, especially for water quality. And so I'm going to end with something called the Green Line. Ralph Nyland, he's a emeritus professor at SUNY ESF. He literally wrote the book on silviculture. And silviculture is sort of for people who need to make some money. And I work with people who, if they don't make money off their forest, they're going to have to fragment it. So harvesting, sustainable harvest, I have to support. As an ecologist, I didn't, but I have to. But he says there's this concept called the Green Line, and we all drive around and we think, you get out. I grew up in Rockland County. You get on the thruway, you're driving up, you're like, oh God, there's trees everywhere. Quality trees aren't there. We can't see beyond those borders of trees along the thruway. We are losing our forests. So the idea of incorporating this into your municipal water system is, I think, incredibly important. It will connect people to the forest. And I was talking to Tim, I said, well, what are some of the things I feel you could benefit from? Droughts are going to be part of the future. So dependency on surface water or reservoir systems, it's best to have a multi-pronged approach and have multiple water sources that you can deal with. And then what was the other one? Oh, if you're monitoring, everybody's doing monitoring, if you have sources of water, well water, that you are monitoring, that could be the early detectors if something is happening. It's not just going to be the water that you are sourcing municipal water from, but there's other people that are often impacted by different things that happen in our water system. So it could be another sort of a monitor to let you know what's going on with water. I'm going to tell you, I put something together, what can your community do if you're interested in taking care of your forest, just some ideas. And I offer a newsletter. It's called You and Your Forest. I send you 7 8-page free editions. I cover forest ecology, invasive species, enhancing your forest for wildlife. If you're interested, I'll put the sign-up sheet on the table where you came in. Okay.
Okay, if I could ask the panelists to come up now. While they come up, I just want to take a minute. I can't help but comment on what I see is so many different faces in the room. I see high school students, college students, colleagues of mine here, local government people, conservationists, land preservation people, and that's really exciting to me. Activists, community leaders, it's a really nice, diverse group of people from different places that are interested in this topic, and I'm going to consider that a success. I also want to thank Mayor Tim Rogers for helping me organize this event. I want to thank my students, Tim Allen and Jess Romanelli, who are standing in the back. They're my sidekicks. I hope you're enjoying them. And they help me out an awful lot. I also want to thank my staff members, Janice Benincasa and Christine Wilkins, who helped us with this event. So let me just introduce the panel. We have Adam Bosch, who, like myself, is a graduate of SUNY New Paltz, and also an adjunct lecturer here. So in addition to our day jobs, we love teaching and New Paltz students so much that we want to come back and also teach you in addition to our jobs.
That's right.
He is the Director of Public Affairs at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Oh, I do need to mention that sadly, Karen Mejia, who is a great friend and was honored as a Hudson hero by Riverkeeper last May. I was really glad to be able to see that happen. She's been very active in the Newburgh water crisis, and she's a councilwoman in Newburgh, but she also got sick today, so we'll sadly miss her tonight. We have Elisa Che, who is my go-to person at DEC these days when it comes to watersheds and water source issues, and she's the source water specialist for the Hudson River Estuary program. We also have on the panel Charlie Burgess from Open Space Institute, representing the land preservation community in our discussion. And my friend Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper, who is the water quality program director there. And finally, another friend, Russell Urban Mead, who is with the Chasing Companies, who hydrogeologist, and environmental professional, and that gives me a good segue into my first question. Russell and Scott Cuppett from Hudson River Estuary Program wrote a paper for the Benjamin Center almost 10 years ago now, I can't believe, called Hudson Valley Water Opportunities and Challenges. We did have some hard copies out there, not sure if there's still any left. If not, you can find it online. And that was when I first got introduced to this idea that, as Russell says, that we are the Saudi Arabia of water, because we have lots and lots of water, right? Quantity is not our issue. We have a lot of other issues, but quantity is not it. And we don't necessarily have the water in the places that we want it, but So that leads me to my first question, and as I said, if you could help the audience sort of connect the dots between our speakers tonight, because we touched on lots of different things, on cost, on environmental benefits, etc. So let me just sharpen that up in a question. Given our growth and the fact that we have abundant water, are there any strategies or planning that would be beneficial to ensure incoming growth take advantage of our water availability, or for whatever reason, this abundance that we have, so that it doesn't negatively impact our water quality or quantity? And if you just want to start with your comments, but just saying like a snippet of, how you want to react to the previous panelists, this topic, that would be great. Does anyone want to volunteer?
I can jump in.
Okay, jump right in.
I can take the low-hanging fruit on this and follow up on Marilyn's talk there. Protect the forests. I mean, that's the key thing, I think, is to make sure that we're really cognizant of preventing forest fragmentation as we're looking at future development plans.
Let me jump in on the Saudi Arabia of water issue, because I've been alternately loved and scolded on that reference since we made it. My perspective is that we get 38 plus inches of precipitation a year here. We have climate modeling suggestions that we're going to have this or more in the future, although the distribution of rainfall may change. And we have the Hudson River gathering water from the majority of New York State and running fresh water past the central Hudson region here, where not until you get to Newburgh does it become saline. So if you think about it, we're right here at what is effectively the freshwater outlet of the Hudson River. So we've got multiple strands, and if you put those all together and you compare that to the Southwest trying to survive on 10 to 15 inches of rain a year and no Hudson River and climate models suggestions going south, that's the context in which I've suggested that relative to the rest of the United States, we're in the Saudi Arabia of water position. That doesn't mean that we don't have local areas of hardship. It doesn't mean that we don't have to plan. But I guess my feeling is, my goodness, if we can't do it here, nobody can do it, and that we should be able to do it. The way that I approach it as a hydrogeologist is that when people come to us with a need, we look at the geologic terrain available to that client site or that project site or the municipal site, and back calculate recharge rates, back calculate what we think is a carrying capacity for the local area, and then look at the geology and figure out how we can make it work for the ecological demands and the human needs. And for various municipalities, we've put together water resource plans that suggest where future development can be, and which areas and at what density could support wells and septics, and what areas can be supported by what water sources. So it does require planning, but I guess my perspective is that once again, if we can't do it here with the water advantages that I just listed, then we're doing something wrong.
So I promise Scott Cuppett, who is my supervisor at the Estuary program and co-wrote the paper that KT mentioned and Russell just spoke to echo what Russell just said, which is, even though overall as a region we may be water rich compared to, say, the western coast of the state, naturally getting more precipitation, which is great, the scarcity can exist in a local level, as Russell said. It can range from the infrastructure maybe not being there to get the water where it's needed or desired. Could be regulations preventing development of certain sources, and there could be financing involved where it might be too expensive to kind of get the water to a usable form or to where it's desired. The other thing too is the rate of water that comes into water systems. With what we heard earlier about climate change and increased kind of flashiness, where you have more intense rain events, that's a lot of precipitation, that's a lot of potential source water. But if it's running on a paved surface and overwhelming treatment plants, that water is going straight into the river ultimately. And yes, there are communities that draw from the river as their drinking water source, but there's a lot of communities on the way that are missing out on that water as well. So it gets complicated, as Russell said, and they do the case-by-case recommendations, which is exactly how it needs to be, because you have those factors, both rate, how quickly the water is coming in, can the systems actually capture it and take advantage of it.
I want to piggyback on something that Russell said about planning. So one thing that New York City has always been pretty good at is planning for the future of its water supply. And a lot of municipalities plan 5-year capital plans or 10-year capital plans. But in New York City's water supply, we just finished a 50-year capital plan. And that is sort of typical of New York City's water supply. The planning horizon has always been decades, not years. And so when we look out 50 years, we're looking at the city owns and operates 24 reservoirs, 60,000 linear feet of dams, 300 miles of aqueducts, and more than 200 water supply facilities, whether those are valve chambers or treatment facilities. And a lot of that stuff is 100 years old or older. The youngest of it is built as recently as the 1960s. And we know that there are going to be upgrades necessary to keep that infrastructure in a state of good repair. The system was built, as they said, to last the ages. It was compared to the great works of Rome, Egypt, and Babylon openly. They said they were setting out to build the greatest waterworks in the history of the world. But that doesn't mean it lasts forever without some tender love and care. And so that's a big part of our 50-year planning. Another part of it has to do with water quality and contaminants of emerging concern, harmful algal blooms, and climate change. We have, in our Kingston office, we have a handful of scientists, I think it's somewhere between 5 and 10, who are taking big global climate models and downscaling them to the size of our watershed so that we can understand what do the effects of climate change mean for New York City's water supply 50 years from now, and what projects should we pursue now to counterbalance those future effects. So if we know the air temperature is going to be warmer and more biologic activity happens in warmer conditions, and that means more algal blooms will likely happen 50 years from now, what can we do now to cut off the nutrient source even more than we have that fuels the growth of that algae and prepare for that change in the climate that's going to happen? And that's just one example, but you know, that planning not just for a few years from now, but thinking about planning horizons that are even farther out than that really helps in the operation of some of these municipal water supplies.
So much I could say here, but I'll just touch a couple points maybe that haven't been mentioned by others. When I look at source water protection, protecting drinking water supplies around the Hudson River Valley, which the Riverkeeper's now involved in quite a bit, the fundamental challenge is home rule. They have different municipalities, each with their own land use regulations. So New York City's got a great program and resources behind protecting forests and partners, such as we heard from the Columbia Green Agroforestry Center. But in most places, it's one community drinking the water, and then the wells or the reservoirs in the next community over, and the watershed, those creeks and streams that feed into that reservoir, or the land around the wellhead, is in the next town over. And it's the next town's decisions about where the Walmart gets built, or where the subdivision is, how the subdivision is subdivided. And all of those things increase, your potential for runoff, as we heard. Every little cut into the forest affects the water quality. So I mention it because I think the absolutely important thing for communities to get their hands around and start working on is intermunicipal cooperation. Because at this point we have relatively few sticks that really work well from the state regulatory framework, relatively few really great carrots. It takes local initiative in the best cases right now to get those kinds of protections in place for any watershed, but particularly those that are involved with drinking water supplies. And I'll just underscore, Adam talking about the New York City drinking water supply. The fundamental lesson of the New York City drinking water supply is that it is less expensive and better to protect the nature around the water source. It's more expensive to treat after the fact. And we're seeing that play out in Newburgh right now, where the city of 30,000 people lost its drinking water supply to a contaminant from firefighting foam that was used at the Air National Guard base, up again in the next town over, upstream of the reservoir. Land use decisions being made by the next town, not the city. And the cost of remediation is going to be in the tens of millions of dollars to install filtration for that water source. So the cost of protection is much lower than the cost of remediation. And just a fact that I think is important for people to be aware of when you think about these things is, there's about 85,000 chemicals in use in our commerce, give or take 1,000 or so. And we look for maybe 100 of them in drinking water supplies. And we've only set a new federal regulation on any of them. We haven't set a new regulation on any of them in like 30 years. So even these chemicals like PFOS and PFOA that are in the news because we all recognize how harmful and toxic they are at even tiny levels, we don't even have regulations that say they shouldn't be in there at the federal level. We have guidelines, we have recommendations. So the regulatory framework for a lot of this stuff is very slow moving and doesn't move as fast as people who want clean water. And if you want it, go out and grab it, get it wherever you can because it's yours, it's what you're going to be drinking.
Russell, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I guess I fully endorse the complication that's related to home rule that you referenced, Dan. Before 10 years ago, the economic decline, I was doing a lot of work for Dutchess County government over about a 10-year period, and the county was attempting to get ahead of some of those those home rule issues by sponsoring studies that would benefit any town that chose to adopt. So one of the things that we wrote in Dutchess County and has been now adopted in a couple Dutchess towns, but also in Phillipstown and has also been looked at in Gardner, is a town aquifer protection ordinance. And the advantage of having a model ordinance is that it's available. You can look at it, tweak it to the local geography, but if multiple municipalities adopt it, there's some uniformity, which gets at one of the issues that you've raised. It can also be personalized as needed. So there is a model ordinance that can be looked at. It is difficult to do because every town has to kind of go through the laborious effort of thinking about it, adopting it, and then enforcing it themselves. I think most of us who think about this know that there had been a pathway through the state health department to adopt watershed rules and regs, but those proved so unpopular because the legislature had to adopt them because they superseded home rule. And so up in Albany, the legislators got an earful every time that they got ready to adopt one of these things because one town objected that a law was being imposed on them for another town. So the model ordinance is very useful. Another resource that's available, once again, thanks to Dutchess County, but it applies to areas that have similar rainfall and geology, is our estimates of aquifer recharge and recommendations on sustainable densities for wells and septics. Dutchess County has, on a countywide basis, a groundwater monitoring program so that there are data available on the condition of the aquifer. Orange County is doing county-wide stream gauging. So there are counties who try to make data available to support municipal efforts, but to your point, I completely endorse the challenge of protecting groundwater quality on a piecemeal basis. The only counterbalance to that is many watersheds that contribute to a particular well. Many times the well field recharge area does lie within one town. So as horrible as it sounds on the watershed scale, often relative to a particular point source, often a lot can be done that's incredibly valuable, notwithstanding the New York City sort of macro challenge. But for many municipalities, many municipal well fields control a lot of their well field within their own town.
Go ahead, Lisa.
So I think for a long time now, as was alluded to at the beginning with our opening, we've taken clean drinking water for granted, and the circumstances have been such that that has gone okay. We haven't really had to deal with much. You turn on the tap, clean water comes out, you can pretty much count on that. Until recently, people are now getting worried and scared because of the events that were mentioned before, Huzik, Flint, and Newburgh. So I think we're also seeing the regulatory structure trying to catch up with the new world as we have it now in terms of water. And as we heard from Sabrina earlier, there is recognition at the state level that it is an issue, and they're making it a priority through the budget amounts and the programs and the new initiatives that are being rolled out. And I think a key piece is we're rediscovering the importance of watersheds and recharge areas for groundwater. So understanding how the water gets to the reservoir and how it gets to the wells, because we've been able to take it for granted for so long. And along with that, as Dan mentioned, we are now discovering this thing called home rule, which has very, very real impacts when it comes to land use management in a neighboring municipality and affecting their drinking water sources. So these are all big challenges, and I think we can take heart, though, and be grateful that we live in New York State, which is recognizing this as an issue, and we have programs and tools that are in place now that can get things moving, and hopefully there'll be more initiatives and more funding down the line. But it's not going to be, this is a bigger problem than any one agency or any one town. It affects many, many people at many different levels. But I think any sort of improvement is going to have to come through coordination at many levels, not only through the inter-municipal coordination that Dan mentioned, but also state and county as well. And in my role as the source water protection specialist for the Estuary program, I have been learning about the different roles of those entities and how they interact or not, or maybe should be. So I think we're seeing the recognition happen at a lot of levels, and we're seeing things happen kind of in real time now with the grants that are coming out. I've talked to a lot of potential grant applicants for the new source water grant that Sabrina mentioned, where they were confused about the sources of information they needed for their applications. So we're at that level, where, as Russell mentioned, some towns, many towns, may not have aquifer overlay districts. They may not have those protection zones in place at the local level, which sounds crazy, but that is the case. So we're trying to pull together a lot of threads here, and I think this is a really neat panel, so thanks for having us here. Anybody else want to jump in? Charlie?
Yeah, can I just, it occurs to me that this issue of the home rule in multiple municipalities each having their own approaches to these problems. There are regional conservation organizations like the organization I work for, the Open Space Institute, or Scenic Hudson, Riverkeeper, that would, I think, they have a regional scale perspective on what's going on in each of these different municipalities. And at the same time, they've also really been focusing on these exact issues for 20 or 30 years. They've been studying, how do we get the best out of our water? How do we protect the quality of water? So, it strikes me that if you're a municipality who is looking to understand what's going on with your neighbors and bring them to the table, that your regional scale conservation organizations and land trusts could be a key player to bring those people together, to have the ability to convene all those different groups and sort of coordinate an effort that's informed scientifically, but also really familiar at the local level with the actual landscape on the ground. So I think that, at the municipal scale, reaching out to your local conservation organizations and regional conservation organizations is really key to kind of helping bring these partnerships together.
So I want to touch upon something that Adam said, because I want to make sure people hear this. When I didn't know this 10 years ago, but on a massive scale, New York City, when they developed the aqueduct system, they did the math of how much it would cost to not do land use regulations up here and to treat the water before it hit New York City. And the math was, there was no competition. Land use regulation won over. Keep the land pristine so it doesn't turn into really expensive treatment systems that are needed at some point before it gets into the city. So we actually have a world-famous example of why land use protection is a better route than going to sort of just get it at the end game and treat the water once it's dirty. So I want to use that as sort of and you just talked about this a little bit, Charlie, as just if the panelists could talk a little bit more about connecting these dots between protecting open space and sourcing drinking water locally on preserved open space, why that should be a recommended best practice. And then Charlie articulated one pathway is that we need to rely on our land preservationists to be a partner in this. What are some other ways that we can do this? What are the paths to doing this better?
So I'll start out. New York City knew from the very moment it built its water supply system that what happens on the land has a direct effect on the quality of the water. And in the beginning, that's why when New York City built Ashokan Reservoir in Ulster County or Kensico Reservoir down in Westchester County, it planted 3 million trees that it raised from saplings to help protect that water. And it inspected privies and all sorts of other things to make sure that the things that were happening on the land did not have an adverse effect on the quality of the water. And we've really worked under that premise ever since. The idea that it is more both cost-effective and environmentally sound to protect drinking water at its source rather than allow that water to become contaminated and then in a large industrial facility try to take those contaminants out after the fact. But that work is difficult, and we're the largest of the unfiltered water supplies in the United States. We're also a little unique because our watershed is a living watershed. So you go out to places like San Francisco or Seattle, they own the entirety of their watershed and there's nobody living in it. So we have to contend with different things. We have to contend with farming and with all the wastewater that's produced and collected in septic systems and municipal wastewater treatment plants. And so our programs have looked sort of holistically at all the activities that are happening on the land in our watershed that eventually funnels water down into our reservoir system, and asked about this from a partnership standpoint. How can we partner with farmers to make sure they can farm efficiently while also farming in a manner that's protective of water quality? How can we work with communities to set up programs that will repair septic systems that aren't collecting wastewater properly because they're broken, or upgrade wastewater treatment plants that aren't completely removing all the nutrients they should and providing a fuel source for algae? And so really New York City has taken a partnership approach to this to work with the folks who live in our watershed to administer a number of programs that the city funds to protect its water supply in that model of source water protection. And just to get at the finances of it, we've been doing this now for 25 years. We've been doing it for longer than that, but under federal regulations, we've been doing it under a federal and state waiver for 25 years. During those 25 years, we've committed about $2.7 billion to our source water protection efforts. And the latest estimate we had is a little old, but rather than doing that, if we had to build a filtration plant for New York City's water supply, it would cost at least $10 billion, and we estimate it would cost somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year to operate because of both chemical and electric costs. Those are old. We're actually in the process right now of updating those estimates because that $10 billion number is about a decade old. So I think in reality, it's probably more 12, 13. It's probably increased quite a bit. Certainly the savings are there and the environmental stewardship mentality is there in those programs as well.
So thoughts on how we take this big way of doing things and scale it down to our smaller places?
I mean, I think that the grant funding that this has been discussed that's coming down from the state, the $110 million for source water protection and sort of the package that it's wrapped in the Clean Water Infrastructure Act, provides some avenues for replicating some amount of the programs that New York City implements. But the fact is that New York City finances its source water protection through ratepayers in the city primarily. And I think getting to the real cost of water is a concept that's talked about a lot in the water industry. You know, that as was kind of discussed in the initial presentations, that we have this assumption that water should be free or very cheap. And the real cost of water is not necessarily as cheap as we think it is, because it's not just the pipes that need to be replaced, and the pump stations and the treatment plants, but the landscape around the wells or the reservoirs, as we've been discussing. So we haven't really made societal sense of that cost and how to share it. There are proposals in the legislature now to, for instance, have a program similar to the heating assistance program, where lower income water users might get assistance for paying their bills if the bills are going up generally. There's other ideas around, how you can share the cost burden of some of these things over time. But the important thing is that these things do get funded, because it's not just, as has been discussed, land conservation, but it might be buffers along streams, it might be farm management, it might be different things in different contexts, and each of those do come with a cost that the downstream user might get.
Right, and one of the things Dan and I have talked about in the past, because as I say, Dan and I follow each other around to a lot of these speaking engagements, but one of the things Dan and I have talked about in the past is when New York City built its water supply, first in the early 1800s in Westchester and Putnam County, it was rural, very low population. Then it came up to the Catskills in the early 1900s through the mid-1900s, rural, very low population. New York City had the advantage. We were starting with a relatively blank slate in terms of what had already been done on that land. But many of the communities that have been mentioned by name tonight are not starting with a relatively blank slate. So Dan has this great slide and presentation that he does of Newburgh's water source, where it's surrounded by 4 highways, dozens of fuel storage tanks, big box stores, massive parking lots. And so I think one of the challenges facing a lot of communities is, if you are not starting with a blank slate, but one that's perhaps quite full, what things can you apply to your watershed that will have the intended effect? And if you're lucky enough to have a blank slate, perhaps you better really take advantage of it.
Right, so a lot of places are not starting with a blank slate. I think from the presentation we heard before from CCE, we get that if you have if you have natural cover, it's certainly worth it to protect it, right? If you don't, then you're looking at kind of remedial measures where you're trying to get technology to mimic what natural cover does, so green infrastructure and things like that. I would say that for communities who are really interested in pursuing some source water protection actions, you got to start with understanding your source watershed or the recharge area. So looking at that, gathering the data. And that's easier said than done. Luckily, there are some grants out there. My program, we issue grants, including watershed assessments. So that's one of the things that I work on. This year, I'll be working with City of Middletown, for example. They are interested in putting together a source water protection plan. So I'll be working with the city to do that. And it's evaluation. We're going to gather information, see what we got, and then see what makes sense in terms of recommendations for the city and the municipalities. Because again, they are an example of a place where their reservoirs are located outside of their municipal boundaries and jurisdiction, and see what makes sense in terms of the financing, the community support, and the ability. But I think the important thing is first to recognize protection as a priority, put some money and effort towards learning what your situation is, and then planning out some actions, including local financing and support along the way. Because in the long term, source water protection efforts and stewardship will have to be carried at the local level. That's the best way to do it. You guys locally know best your watershed and recharge areas, and the state has funding and technical support to help programs, things like that, but we can't be everywhere at once, right? So.
I think probably the best advice I've heard in the last many years comes from Jim Tierney at PDC, who said that the fundamental challenge for watersheds is, in terms of rainwater and stormwater, is slow it down, spread it out, and let it soak in. And if you remember those 3 things, there are so many places you can do that. And you can do that at the backyard scale. You can do that. I've done micro grading in my backyard, which you can't see because I did it, and now I have a mowed lawn, but I have a series of micro terraces, and there are little places that flood to 1 inch, and then go over a little crest, and then flood to a 1 inch. Doesn't bother my lawn a bit, and I know that I'm promoting recharge on my own property. There are things you can do on the micro scale that are incredibly useful. Then there are things that can be done at the town scale. There are things that can be done on the watershed scale. I have a bone to pick with the DEC after having just complimented them. I think that one of our premier inadvertent assets are our undersized culverts. Because our undersized culverts are in fact built detention basins. And after every major rain, there's a temporary backup that slows and allows the water to precisely slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. And I think it's practically criminal that we're trying to reverse that, except in the places where there's the risk that a road can be damaged. But I think in all other regards, undersized culverts are our friends, and they're already built. And I have everything to do to try to change that policy, but I've been completely unsuccessful.
I was waiting to look for anyone who lives in a floodplain who might want to jump over the table.
You heard my caveat. There are places where an undersized caveat is destructive. It is terrible. But the majority of undersized culverts do a perfectly fine job of slowing it down and spreading it out and soaking it in. And I don't know what, I completely agree that they should be installed where a fish can swim through. So a perched culvert, hey, listen, I'm all for that, fix that, but keep it undersized.
I think I'd like to take it to the audience for people who might have questions for the panelists. Mayor Tim Rogers from the Village of New Paltz has a mic, and he will come to you. So if you have a question, or do you have a question to start us off, Tim? Or
yeah, coincidentally, I do have a question.
Coincidentally?
So, Sabrina commented on the grant program, and a few folks on the panel commented on grant opportunities. We spent a lot of money applying for grants last year. We didn't get any awards. Chasing down grants is time-consuming and very expensive. So one thing we've been trying to do differently in New Paltz is to proactively look at properties that we already own, or properties where we've used taxpayer funds to protect open space. So I'm curious if the panel had any thoughts about how do we get regulators and state agencies comfortable with, you know, a lot of the points that have been highlighted here tonight, to make, you know, the local municipality's job a little bit easier to source more local water, as opposed to just crossing our fingers and hoping we get awarded grants.
So I would say, yes, it's easy to say to just go apply for a grant. There's a lot of work involved in putting together an application. I think one of the keys to success is talking early on with the program that's administering the grant. Before it's announced, early conversations so that they can really understand what you're trying to do and advise on how best that fits the grant, or maybe not, or refer to a different grant. So I think for your situation, I think reaching out to those relevant agencies or groups that you think might be relevant, getting them familiar with your goals, and getting their feedback and advice on how best to approach it. And I say that reach out to them early, because once a grant is announced is generally when a lot of people will find out about it and then start working on it and then start thinking about applying for it. We have kind of a gag order at that point. Once a grant is announced, we are not allowed to talk about the details of an application with a potential applicant, because that's seen as a conflict of interest. It's unfair. I didn't make it up. It's in the statute. We can't talk to potential applicants about details after the grant is announced. So early on, just find out when the grants are usually announced that you might be interested in applying for. Reach out to the staff early and talk about the details then.
The other thing is to try and influence the criteria of the grant if it's not fitting your needs, and do that through the legislative process. Work with your state, assemblymen, senators, have them work on tweaking the criteria if it needs to be more favorable for, the particular project, which I think is, in New Paltz's case, was one of the issues was, does the project really line up with the grant criteria as it's written? So it's still getting back to like, oh, grants are the, end all be all, like going to solve all the problems, and they're certainly not. But it is going to, at least it's a pathway to maybe be more successful in one of those grant applications. And intermunicipal cooperation is another point that tends to help with those.
Anybody else?
Tim, you've done a good job with this, and I know other communities that are doing as well, is looking for the twofers. And I think what we're seeing recently is that there's some overlapping objectives between land trusts and municipalities seeking water supplies. I mean, land trusts own land that is often very valuable as recharge area, and so there's mutual interest, which is also an opportunity for enhanced leverage in terms of trying to make a project go forward. There was a comment that I showed a flash of personality previously, and I will let a second cat out. I was a town board member in Hyde Park before the 2% tax cut, and we did what we called town planning, and we were thinking about X years down the road, and we were trying to make projects happen over longer periods of time. And I've watched since the 2% tax cut came in, and I've watched town after town basically have their budgets be cut to nothing more than maintenance. And the only thing that allows a new project to take place is something that is funded by a grant. And you don't know whether you're going to get one, and there's front-end money you have to put together to get the grant, and it turns into a Hunger Games kind of situation. I don't think we're going anyplace good with it with this current model. And I have full sympathy for any town just basically trying to make it all together with paying basic expenses and praying for grants. I don't see it working very well, and I know that as consultants at purchasing companies, we've seen towns just really struggle with it. So, but I think one flash of good news is maybe this point of intersection between what land trusts have interests in doing and what towns need, at least for the subject of water supply.
Tim, Jerry has a question?
No, I have a comment.
Hold on. Go ahead, sorry.
One answer is to look in non-obvious places. I mean, the governor is incentivizing intermunicipal collaboration for everything. And counties are directed to present plans annually. And there's, in the statute, in the budget, there's a call for an annual process to be mandated for collaboration. So it's not an environmental program. It's a collaboration program. So you have to be a little imaginative where you look. And another interesting point about that is since the counties are given leadership, they're likely to emphasize county priorities. And county priorities are less likely to be water systems. Because the water systems are owned and operated by towns, villages, mostly villages and cities. So the participants in these processes who must sign off must work hard to get their priorities as part of the collaborative proposals at the county level, and not accept a definition of the conventional, the usual suspects being rounded up to meet these mandated requirements.
Questions? Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you. I was wondering about the role of watershed councils and their relative power in influencing or helping municipalities make smarter land use decisions, and also in terms of the intermunicipal cooperation around watershed management.
Sure. So our program works a lot with local watershed groups and helps to build the capacity of those groups, because we believe that they have a very important role at the local level, both in informing other residents about watershed basics and reasons behind why certain actions should be taken, or even just bringing certain issues to light. So highlighting watersheds as an issue. I think a role for watershed groups right now in councils is to make the connection between drinking water and the drainage areas for them, to speak broadly, covering both the surface and groundwater, right? So the watersheds for your reservoirs and the recharge areas for wells, making that connection. Because even though it was known, I think in the past, we've kind of forgotten it, and the utility bill rate structures, the regulations kind of reflect that, where there's a lot of regulations and focus on drinking water treatment plant processes and regulations for finished water standards, but there isn't much in terms of the open space component or the recharge areas, the watershed side of the drinking water equation. So I think community groups could play an important role in kind of broadcasting that message, bringing it more to your town meetings at the county level, just letting those in charge and having decision-making roles on water understand that and not let them forget about that.
In Newburgh, you have a great example of a really effective watershed group, the Quisqueya Creek Watershed Alliance, and a lot of what we know about the problems with Newburgh's drinking water supply and the overdevelopment around it, we know because of 10 years or so of work, a lot of it the Estuary program funded, but a lot of work by the county water authority, but a lot by citizens who just come together every month and take on projects and get to know their watershed really well. And when they see problems and see ways they can find solutions, they talk about it and they make noise. And you know, one of the greatest stories that came out of the Quisqueya Creek Watershed Alliance was this gentleman, Peter Smith, architect, who, you know, one of the tools that he was able to get through the help from the Hudson River Estuary program was just to learn how to use PowerPoint. Then he made a PowerPoint presentation about all the problems with the watershed, and all the whole people started to learn about problems in the watershed. So it's really, it can be very low tech, it can be very, you know, individually driven, but they can make a really big difference at times.
If we're talking about, is this addressing your question?
Yes, I guess I wasn't clear on my question. It seems that these volunteer groups are very interested in protecting their watershed. And they do a variety of different things in order to try to protect it. But I guess what I'm not so clear on is the true level of power that they can have at the municipal level to influence their municipalities, their specific municipalities. And I understand that this is all a collaborative process, and that's all well and good, but I think that I don't know, maybe there needs to be a little bit more infrastructure or attention paid to these watershed groups to embolden them to be more like the Quisqueya Creek Watershed Alliance.
So you're exactly right that most of the watershed organizations that I know of have no legislative authority. And particularly if they have an active membership residing in more than one town, they have, in a sense, there's the risk of dilution there in terms of impact on a particular town. They don't have the appointed authority of a CAC member. They don't have the slightly higher level of authority of a CAB. They're a bully pulpit and an advocacy group in most cases, and not much more. The ones that, for whom the water drains into a drinking water supply have some leverage that others do not. Part of the Quisqueya drains into Washington Lake. But I've seen watershed groups in municipality or in watersheds where the watershed simply drains to the Hudson and nobody drinks it. And there are people who love salamanders and trees and fish, but that's a subset. And if nobody's drinking it, it doesn't pull in that next emotional level, which is our water. You know, so there's a sort of a logistical disadvantage there, and you know, Riverkeeper's been doing a good job identifying at least some of the quality issues in those creeks, even if people aren't drinking them. But the awareness factor is there, the lack of legislative authority is there. Until very recently, the DEC didn't have in-stream flow requirements. So in fact, there was no way of measuring whether too much water had been taken from a stream to the point where it didn't flow, the flow wasn't functional. And even now that there are in-stream flow regulations, they're only called upon when needed. Most of the individual uses are approved on a per-use basis as opposed to an aggregate basis. So I think you've hit upon a challenge. I'm on the board of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, and Dan Shapley has just joined us on the board. One of the things we attempt to do with the Watershed Alliance is provide resources and moral support and educational sessions to watershed group members so that at least they can be more informed advocates. But at this point, most of them are functioning as advocates.
I guess just, not to belabor it, but there's another style of watershed group, which is the Inter-Municipal Council, and it still might not have power, but at least it has a membership that's made up of officials from each of the towns within the watershed or municipality, say, so that there's a voting structure and something that has a little, more decision-making capability, perhaps, or influence on the individual towns.
Can I just chime in that, and this is, I'm sort of maybe stepping back a little, but, I think that speaking to Tim's point before about, we put all this work into grants and then we don't get them. I don't want to just go back to harping on planning, but I think that maybe these watershed councils can also act to kind of bring people together around the same issue. And I wanted to talk a little bit about OSR's work in the Delaware watershed, where, basically the idea with this planning is to identify and prioritize the lands that will most benefit water quality, right? And so, in a way, planning sometimes seems like an expensive way of finding out what we already know, but I think that if you're, in order to, in that dialogue leading up to the actual application for these grants, if you can come to the table with scientific rigor behind the strategy that you're presenting, then I think that makes a really a much stronger case. In our case, in Delaware, we're looking at recharge capacity, the headwaters, because if you lose the headwaters, it's really difficult to recover, what's downstream, soils, forested stream buffers, and land cover, and kind of laying all that on top of each other, and what rises to the surface are sort of the key areas for protection. So if you've got whether it's surface water or a ground, site, if you can layer all that stuff up and identify what rises to the surface for protection, I think it makes a really strong case. And going back to that point of, land trust serving as the go-between for the intermunicipal partnership, it may be that your local land trust would do this work for you, because they're interested in the same stuff. They want to get their hands on that same money, and they may also have other avenues of funding that they can bring to the table to help make this all happen. So, I think the idea is that there's all these different, so not only are there all these different characteristics that contribute to clean water, but there are all these different pots of funding that are looking to fund different things, the farmland protection and the source water protection, and then there's scenic view sheds, and then there's, the rich guy who doesn't want something screwing up his mountain view, and all that stuff comes together, and you lay it all on a map, and I think you can really make a compelling case that you can accomplish these projects. So.
All right, we're going to take another question.
Good evening. My name is Alan Hughes, and in an earlier part of my misspent youth, I was the president of the Orange County Planning Federation, and during my tenure there, it occurred to me that a lot of your municipal officials have no idea where their water comes from or where it goes to. And for the young lady here that's looking to exert some pressure with CAC groups and everything, like everyone here in the room knows, it's all about education. The faucet's magic. You spin it and the water comes out. And when it goes down for the 5 o'clock flush, no one knows where it goes. And the killer that makes this all come to an awful head is segmentation. You've got to do the whole valley. You got to see the drainage, you got to see the rainfall, you got to see where it's going to go to. You got to see the recharge factors, you got to see all of these elements put together in one big package so you can properly design not to put yourself out of business. Now, what happens is the politician, the board of directors, if you will, and the CEO, the supervisor, are supposed to act upon the taxpayers, the investors, on how they want their money spent. And some of it's a territory war. They're the boss and they're the chief CEO and the board of directors. Maybe they don't want to hear it. But if you can introduce it on the table where everybody can understand that by working together, we can reduce costs, save the waste, eliminate the waste, and get what we need. What's happening is most of your board of directors, your town boards, don't know where the water comes from. They don't know what the guy does at the plant. They don't know what the guy does at the sewage plant. They're so busy trying to run the paperwork war of government, they really don't take the time to go out there. Now, I know just about everybody at the front table there and half the people in the building. And I've been out trudging in the streams, showing them where it comes from and putting this all together where it's time we take this back and clean it up once and for all and inform our town boards that we need to do this, not with the creeping subdivision doing 20 lots at a time, but looking at that whole valley and that township that we're going to develop and make sure we have an overall plan that will come together and not leave chopped off blocks and runoff problems because of poor design. It's all about education, and you got to bring it to your town boards. You have to inform them about their reservoirs and how the water gets into their reservoirs, because I would dare to bet that 60% of them don't know where it comes from. And this is the original part of the problem. So thanks for listening to what I have to say, and if anybody wants to know how to get there, I can make the devil cry out. Let's get it.
So education has another benefit too, and I grew up playing in Downing Park, so I want to thank animals. But education has another effect too. You know, I was just talking about this morning with another group. When New York City sort of turned on the waterworks from the Catskills, October 14th, 1917, there were 3 days of parades, celebrations, concerts, because people followed very closely the construction of it and took great pride in the fact that their municipality was setting out to build infrastructure to deliver a critical natural resource to them. And I think that if we do a better job at educating people about the natural resources that sustain them and the infrastructure and the hard work that it takes to get it to them, it may be easier to then fund some of these infrastructure projects and get the public support for actually spending the money. Because Animal's right, a lot of people, even in New York City, when I go down to New York City to give public talks, a lot of people go, I don't drink the Hudson River? No, you don't drink the Hudson River. So, you know, I think it would also help in getting financing for some of the projects that need to be done if people were more educated about what actually goes into it.
I have the original pictures, by the way, if you would like.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have one more. Sheffield?
I think I guess. No.
Dr. Chowdhury, I should say.
We have been hearing, protecting the recharge areas around our neighborhood. So how well defined those recharge areas are? Sometimes the recharge areas could be kilometers away from the aquifer system that we try to tap into. So that is the question for the audience and to Russell also.
Well, if you're talking about recharge areas for water sources, then very quickly we have to first distinguish between surface water resources and groundwater resources. The surface water resources would be a reservoir, right, or a lake. And either one of those, the topographic land that drains into that body of water would be your recharge watershed. And typically there's an assumption that which travels the shortest time needs to be protected most highly because it has the least amount of time to be naturally remediated. But as Marilyn Wyman said today, a forest or natural landscape can do a great job of providing some buffering and remediation. So travel distance is often your friend. So it's the uses closest to a water body that you might need to pay the most attention to. For groundwater sources, we tend to think of groundwater resources in two categories. There's the immediate recharge area, or there's the aquifer zone that is closest to the well, where the travel distance and perhaps the type of formation is most conducive for flow, and that might be an area that deserves a higher level of protection. And then there are areas up, and people think that aquifers are sort of mysterious, but the way I simplify it for myself so I don't get confused is we all know what overland flow is. Well, groundwater is just underland flow. It obeys the same rules. It's going from a higher area to a lower area. So if you're standing in your backyard and there's an area way down in the valley below you, there's no way the groundwater down there is coming up to you. But if you look up to the hill to your left, and that's the highland, that's the groundwater that's migrating towards you. So it's just underground flow. And now you don't have to hire me because I've given it away. But that's sort of the essential truth of it. So if you have a groundwater source, there's the area that's close by and that's going to enter your well most quickly, and then there's the landscape that's above you that it sure is shooting, underland flow is going to be migrating towards you as the water that will get to your well 3 months from now, 6 months from now, or 2 years from now. And you might have more time to respond, plus Mother Nature has an amazing way of doing some amount of bioremediation along the way. So you have your higher priority and your lower priority areas, and that's how we map recharge areas. And often, if you're, some people who know me know that I often talk about whether one is high or low in the watershed. The advantage of being low in the watershed is that you have a lot of watershed bringing water towards your location. It gives you a very stable source. The disadvantage is everybody else owns everything between you and up there. So if nasty things happen up there, it's coming at you. So if you want, I live on a little lot in Hyde Park, and I'm very glad to be right near the top of a mountain because there's almost no watershed above me, and I don't have to worry about anybody pissing on it, right? And I don't actually own it, but it's open space, so I know that I have really nice water flowing towards my well, but I also know that because I'm high in the watershed, during a dry period, I don't have a lot of recharge area, so I don't have a voluminous source. So if I want a voluminous source, I want to be low in the watershed, but then I have to think about protection. Perhaps more answer than you had asked for, but that's my 2 cents.
I think maybe one more we still have time for, if anybody has a question. Or if we don't.
Can I just make just a quick point, which is that we always think about, we often think about forests for, and the importance of forests for protecting surface water, stream buffers and that kind of thing, but it's just as important for groundwater. So you look at that recharge area, a forested recharge area is going to more effectively filter the groundwater.
Connecticut has the best protection laws for their watershed areas as our closest neighbor. Look into it. You won't believe what they have going on.
Tim, I think Supervisor Dr. Martinez has a question.
If someone else has a question. Okay, so when I was reading through the report from the comptroller, it says that we're $20 to $40 billion behind with infrastructure spending. I was heartened to see last night in the State of the Union that our president has a plan to fund infrastructure. However, that funding is going to be mostly private funding, and when I look through the prices that different people pay for water in the state, the comptroller report says the 2 highest towns or municipalities, those are privatized water areas. And so should we be worried about privatizing our water systems with this new infrastructure fund?
Wow. Yes.
You want somebody else to control your water.
Neil, we've been approached by individuals who make that same point where they hear me whining about how expensive it is to update our 100-year-old infrastructure, and they say, well, why don't you just privatize it? And I don't really understand how that could be a solution by adding an additional party who then needs to make money. I don't understand how the math works, like adding someone else with their hand in the cookie jar. Like, how do you repair water, provide safe and affordable water without raising rates?
I would also mention, if you're really interested in it, talk to people in Rockland County and the issues with Suez. They're experiencing it firsthand.
So, Katie, we're done. I wanted to say thanks for everyone who attended, but also to the Comptroller's Office and the Hudson River Estuary Program. And Animal was making the point earlier that we really need to get the local governments aware of this discussion. And there were three main parties who got this together, and it was the local government. The Village of New Paltz was very interested in having this conversation because we want our boards, our local decision makers, our local constituents all to be aware of the opportunity, where we can get this right and what we need to be doing differently. So, thanks for emphasizing how important it is to get our local boards aware. But I can assure for you that, that's exactly what we're trying to do by getting folks together here.